The prestigious Willowbrook Academy had always prided itself on maintaining the highest standards of conduct among its students. However, beneath the polished marble floors and gleaming trophy cases, a troubling pattern of behavior was beginning to emerge that would soon shake the very foundations of the institution. Isabella Whitmore, the headmistress of this elite private school, noticed the first signs during the autumn semester. Young Oliver Pemberton, grandson of the wealthy philanthropist Margaret Pemberton, had been displaying increasingly aggressive behavior toward his younger classmates. What started as minor incidents of name-calling had escalated into something far more concerning. The target of Oliver's harassment was 8-year-old Lucas Hamilton, a bright and gentle boy whose mother, Catherine Hamilton, served as the school's volunteer coordinator. Lucas had always been well-liked by both students and teachers, known for his kindness toward others and his remarkable ability to make friends easily. His infectious smile and willingness to help anyone in need made him a natural leader among the younger students. Catherine had begun to notice changes in her son's behavior at home. Lucas, once eager to share stories about his school day, had become withdrawn and reluctant to discuss his experiences at Willowbrook. His appetite diminished, and she often found him staring out his bedroom window with a distant look in his eyes. When she gently pressed him for information, Lucas would simply shrug and say everything was fine. But Catherine's maternal instincts told her otherwise. The situation reached a critical point during a routine playground observation. Mrs. Thompson, one of the supervising teachers, witnessed Oliver deliberately pushing Lucas off the swing set while calling him hurtful names. What made the incident particularly disturbing was the calculated nature of Oliver's actions. He had waited until the teacher's attention was momentarily diverted before striking, then quickly assumed an innocent pose when adults looked in their direction. Mrs. Thompson immediately reported the incident to Isabella, who found herself in a delicate position. Margaret Pemberton was not only one of the school's most generous donors, but also held significant influence within the community's social circles. The Pemberton family's contributions had funded the new science wing and provided scholarships for several deserving students. Isabella knew that handling this situation would require careful consideration and diplomatic skill. During her investigation, Isabella discovered that Oliver's behavior pattern extended beyond the single incident Mrs. Thompson had witnessed. Several teachers came forward with their own observations, describing how Oliver would subtly intimidate younger students during group activities, steal their lunch money, and spread rumors designed to isolate his targets from their peer groups. The boy had developed a sophisticated system of psychological manipulation that was particularly effective against sensitive children like Lucas. Catherine remained unaware of the full extent of what her son was experiencing. Lucas had been taught to resolve conflicts peacefully and was hesitant to report the bullying, fearing it might escalate the situation further. He had tried various strategies to avoid Oliver, including changing his route to classes and eating lunch in the library, but Oliver seemed to seek him out with relentless determination. The breaking point came during a school assembly when Oliver publicly humiliated Lucas in front of the entire student body. As Lucas was walking to his seat, Oliver deliberately tripped him, causing him to fall and drop his books. The incident occurred in full view of parents, teachers, and students, yet Oliver managed to make it appear accidental. However, several observant parents noticed Oliver's smirk and the way he whispered something to his friends. Immediately afterward, Isabella realized that the situation had reached a point where immediate action was necessary. The school's reputation for providing a safe learning environment was at stake, and she could no longer ignore the mounting evidence of Oliver's systematic bullying. She also recognized that Catherine deserved to know what her son was enduring, despite Lucas's attempts to protect her from worry. That evening, Isabella made the difficult decision to contact Catherine directly. She knew this conversation would set in motion a series of events that would test the school's commitment to its stated values of respect, integrity, and compassion. As she dialed Catherine's number, Isabella steeled herself for what was sure to be a challenging discussion about a situation that threatened to divide the school community. Catherine Hamilton sat in stunned silence as Isabella Whitmore's words echoed through the phone. The revelation that her beloved son Lucas had been systematically bullied for weeks left her feeling a mixture of heartbreak, anger, and guilt. How had she missed the signs? How had her intuitive understanding of her child failed her when he needed her most? The next morning, Catherine approached Lucas with gentle determination. She sat beside him at the breakfast table and took his small hands in hers, looking directly into his eyes as she spoke. When she asked him directly about Oliver Pemberton, Lucas's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled. Tears streamed down his face as he recounted the daily torment he had endured, the fear that had become his constant companion, and his desperate attempts to handle the situation alone. Catherine listened with growing fury as Lucas described how Oliver had systematically targeted him, not just with physical aggression, but with psychological warfare designed to erode his confidence and self-worth. Oliver had told other children that Lucas was weird, that his family was poor, and that anyone who befriended him would become the next target. The isolation strategy had been devastatingly effective, leaving Lucas feeling abandoned and alone in an environment that should have been safe and nurturing. Armed with this information, Catherine scheduled an immediate meeting with Isabella Whitmore. She arrived at the school with a comprehensive list of dates, incidents, and witnesses, having spent the previous evening helping Lucas document everything he could remember. Catherine's background as a former journalist had taught her the importance of thorough documentation, and she intended to ensure that every aspect of Oliver's behavior was properly recorded. Isabella found herself face-to-face with a transformed Catherine Hamilton. Gone was the soft-spoken volunteer coordinator who had always deferred to authority figures. In her place sat a fierce mother determined to protect her child and ensure that no other student would suffer as Lucas had. Catherine's presentation was methodical, professional, and utterly devastating in its thoroughness. The evidence Catherine presented painted a picture of systematic bullying that had been allowed to continue unchecked for far too long. She had statements from other parents whose children had witnessed incidents, documentation of Lucas's declining grades and changed behavior, and even screenshots of social media posts where Oliver had mocked Lucas to their classmates. The comprehensive nature of her evidence made it impossible for the school administration to dismiss the situation as a simple childhood conflict. Isabella realized that her delicate approach to the Pemberton situation had failed both Lucas and the school community. Her hesitation to take decisive action, motivated by concerns about donor relations and political considerations, had allowed a vulnerable child to suffer unnecessarily. The weight of this realization settled heavily on her shoulders as she acknowledged the institutional failure that had occurred under her leadership. Catherine's demands were clear and non-negotiable. She wanted Oliver removed from Lucas's classes immediately, a formal apology from both Oliver and his family, implementation of comprehensive anti-bullying policies, and mandatory counseling for Oliver to address his behavioral issues. She also insisted on transparency, requesting that other parents be informed about the situation so they could monitor their own children's interactions with Oliver. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Catherine revealed that she had been documenting not just Oliver's actions but also the school's inadequate response to previous complaints. She had discovered that other parents had reported concerns about Oliver's behavior in the past, but their complaints had been minimized or dismissed entirely. This pattern of institutional negligence had enabled Oliver's behavior to escalate to its current level. Isabella found herself in an impossible position. Margaret Pemberton's influence extended far beyond financial contributions to the school. She served on the board of directors for several local charities, was married to a prominent judge, and had connections throughout the community's power structure. Confronting the Pemberton family about Oliver's behavior would likely result in significant consequences for the school's funding and Isabella's own career. However, Catherine made it clear that she was prepared to take the matter public if the school failed to act decisively. She had already consulted with attorneys about potential legal action and was considering contacting local media outlets about the school's failure to protect students from bullying. Her transformation from cooperative volunteer to fierce advocate sent a clear message that she would not be intimidated or placated with empty promises. The meeting concluded with Isabella promising to take immediate action, but Catherine left with the distinct impression that the headmistress was more concerned about managing the political fallout than addressing the underlying issues that had allowed Oliver's behavior to flourish. As she drove home, Catherine began formulating a plan that would force the school to prioritize student safety over donor relationships, regardless of the consequences. Margaret Pemberton received Isabella Whitmore's phone call during her weekly bridge game at the exclusive Hillcrest Country Club. The conversation that followed would become legendary among the club's members, not for its content, which remained diplomatically vague, but for Margaret's increasingly flustered responses and her eventual abrupt departure from the table. The distinguished, elderly woman had built her reputation on her family's unblemished social standing and her grandson's exceptional academic achievements. Oliver was her pride and joy, a brilliant child who excelled in mathematics and debate, qualities that reminded her of her late husband's intellectual prowess. The suggestion that this remarkable boy could be capable of systematic bullying seemed not just impossible but personally insulting. Margaret's first instinct was to dismiss the allegations entirely. She had raised Oliver since his parents' tragic accident 3 years earlier, and she believed she knew his character intimately. The boy she saw at home was polite, articulate, and respectful to adults. He helped elderly neighbors with their groceries, volunteered at charity events, and maintained excellent grades while participating in multiple extracurricular activities. The idea that this same child could terrorize a younger student seemed completely inconsistent with everything she observed. However, Margaret was also a shrewd woman who understood the delicate nature of social dynamics within elite institutions. She had invested considerable time and money in establishing the Pemberton family's position within Willowbrook Academy's community, and she recognized that these allegations, regardless of their validity, posed a significant threat to everything she had worked to build. Margaret's meeting with Oliver that evening revealed a side of her grandson she had never seen before. When confronted directly about his interactions with Lucas Hamilton, Oliver's carefully maintained facade began to crack. His initial denials were confident and convincing, but as Margaret pressed for specific details about his daily activities, inconsistencies began to emerge in his story. The breakthrough came when Margaret mentioned that several teachers had witnessed his behavior toward Lucas. Oliver's expression shifted from innocent confusion to calculating assessment, as if he was rapidly evaluating his options and deciding on the most effective strategy. This moment of cold calculation in an 11-year-old child chilled Margaret to the bone and forced her to confront an uncomfortable truth about her grandson's character. Oliver's eventual confession was delivered with a disturbing lack of remorse. He explained his actions toward Lucas as a natural response to what he perceived as weakness and vulnerability. In Oliver's worldview, Lucas's gentle nature and emotional sensitivity marked him as an appropriate target for dominance displays. The boy showed no understanding of the pain he had caused, viewing his behavior as a form of social education rather than cruelty. Margaret found herself grappling with a moral crisis that challenged everything she believed about family loyalty and social responsibility. Her natural instinct was to protect Oliver at all costs, using her influence and resources to minimize the consequences of his actions. However, she also recognized that enabling his behavior would likely lead to escalation and potentially more serious incidents in the future. The situation became more complicated when Margaret learned that Catherine Hamilton had documented Oliver's behavior extensively and was prepared to pursue legal action if the school failed to respond appropriately. Catherine's background as a journalist meant she understood how to build a compelling case and present it effectively to both institutional authorities and public audiences. Margaret's attempts to contact Catherine directly were rebuffed, as Catherine had anticipated this approach and prepared herself for pressure tactics from the Pemberton family. Catherine's attorney had advised her to avoid direct communication with the opposing party, recognizing that Margaret's considerable social influence could be used to intimidate or manipulate her into accepting an inadequate resolution. The legal implications of the situation became clear when Margaret consulted with her own attorney. Oliver's systematic targeting of Lucas, combined with the school's documented failure to respond to previous complaints, created potential liability for both assault and institutional negligence. The attorney warned that if the case went to court, the discovery process would likely reveal additional instances of problematic behavior that could seriously damage the family's reputation. Margaret realized that her previous strategy of using social Influence to resolve problems quietly would be insufficient in this situation. Catherine Hamilton had effectively neutralized the traditional power dynamics that Margaret relied upon, creating a level playing field where evidence and legal principles would determine the outcome, rather than social connections and financial leverage. The pressure intensified. When Margaret learned that other parents at Willowbrook Academy were beginning to share their own concerns about Oliver's behavior, incidents that had been dismissed as minor conflicts or personality clashes were being re-examined in light of the Hamilton family's revelations, creating a pattern of behavior that was difficult to deny or explain away. Catherine Hamilton's strategy shifted into high gear when she realized that traditional channels were failing to produce meaningful results. Despite Isabella Whitmore's promises of immediate action, Oliver remained in Lucas's classes, and the only visible change was increased supervision during recess periods. This superficial response convinced Catherine that more dramatic measures were necessary to force genuine institutional change. Her first step was to connect with other parents who had experienced similar issues. Through careful networking and discreet inquiries, Catherine discovered that the Hamilton family was not alone in their struggle with Oliver's behavior. Sarah Mitchell, whose daughter Emma had been targeted the previous year, came forward with detailed documentation of incidents that had been dismissed by school administrators as normal childhood conflicts. The pattern that emerged was deeply troubling. Oliver's targeting strategy was sophisticated and calculated, focusing on children from families with less social influence than the Pembertons. He seemed to instinctively understand power dynamics within the school community, avoiding confrontation with children whose parents held positions of authority or significant wealth, while systematically tormenting those he perceived as vulnerable. Catherine's journalistic background proved invaluable as she began building a comprehensive case file that documented not just Oliver's behavior, but the institutional failures that had enabled it to continue. She discovered that Willowbrook Academy's anti-bullying policies existed primarily on paper, with little evidence of consistent implementation or enforcement. Staff training on recognizing and addressing bullying was minimal, and there were no clear protocols for escalating concerns when initial interventions failed. The breakthrough came when Catherine learned about the school's upcoming annual fundraising gala, a high-profile event that attracted wealthy donors, local politicians, and community leaders. Margaret Pemberton was scheduled to receive a humanitarian award for her charitable contributions, and the event would celebrate the school's achievements while soliciting continued financial support from influential families. Catherine realized that this event presented an opportunity to force public accountability in a way that private meetings and diplomatic channels had failed to achieve. She began developing a plan that would expose the contradiction between the school's public image and its actual practices, while highlighting the real-world impact of administrative failures on vulnerable children. Working with the other affected families, Catherine organized a coordinated response that would be impossible for the school administration to ignore or minimize. They prepared detailed presentations documenting specific incidents, institutional failures, and the long-term impact on their children's educational experience and emotional well-being. The group's demands were clear and specific. They wanted Oliver immediately transferred to a different school, comprehensive retraining for all staff on bullying recognition and intervention, implementation of transparent reporting procedures for future incidents, and public acknowledgement of the institutional failures that had allowed the situation to deteriorate. Catherine's most strategic move was reaching out to local media outlets with expertise in educational issues and child welfare. She provided them with carefully documented evidence while emphasizing the broader implications of the case for school accountability and student safety. The story had all the elements that journalists found compelling: a David versus Goliath narrative, clear evidence of institutional failure, and sympathetic victims whose suffering could have been prevented. The response from Willowbrook Academy's administration was swift and defensive. Isabella Whitmore attempted to characterize the situation as an unfortunate misunderstanding between families, suggesting that both children bore responsibility for the conflict. This response demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of bullying dynamics and further inflamed the affected family's frustration with the school's leadership. Margaret Pemberton's reaction was equally problematic. Rather than acknowledging Oliver's behavior and seeking appropriate interventions, she began a campaign to discredit Catherine Hamilton and the other families. She questioned their motives, suggested they were seeking financial compensation, and implied that their children were partially responsible for the conflicts they had experienced. This victim-blaming approach backfired spectacularly when Catherine released audio recordings of her conversations with school administrators. The recordings clearly demonstrated the school's reluctance to take meaningful action and revealed the extent to which donor relationships influenced administrative decision-making. The contrast between private admissions of concern and public minimization of the issues created a credibility crisis for the institution. The situation reached a tipping point when Emma Mitchell's parents revealed that their daughter had been receiving counseling for anxiety and depression directly related to Oliver's harassment. The psychological impact on the children became impossible to dismiss as minor childhood drama, forcing the community to confront the serious consequences of allowing systematic bullying to continue unchecked. Catherine's careful documentation and strategic approach had successfully transformed a private dispute into a public accountability crisis that demanded institutional reform rather than cosmetic adjustments. The annual Willowbrook Academy fundraising gala transformed from a celebration into a public relations nightmare when Catherine Hamilton and her allies executed their carefully planned intervention. As Margaret Pemberton stepped forward to receive her humanitarian award, a coordinated group of parents stood up throughout the ballroom, each holding photographs of their children and signs detailing the bullying incidents that had been ignored by school administration. The visual impact was devastating. The elegant ballroom, filled with the community's most influential figures, suddenly became the backdrop for a powerful demonstration of parental determination and institutional accountability. Catherine had orchestrated the moment perfectly, ensuring that the contrast between the school's public image and its actual practices could not be ignored or dismissed. Margaret Pemberton froze at the podium as she realized the scope of the organized protest. Her acceptance speech, carefully crafted to emphasize her commitment to child welfare and educational excellence, became impossible to deliver with any credibility. The room fell silent as parents began reading brief statements about their children's experiences, each testimony adding weight to the collective indictment of the school's failures. The media coverage that followed was extensive and damaging. Local television stations led their evening broadcasts with footage from the gala, while newspapers ran in-depth investigations into the school's handling of bullying complaints. The story resonated far beyond the immediate community, attracting attention from educational advocacy groups and child welfare organizations throughout the region. Catherine's strategic use of social media amplified the impact exponentially. The hashtag Moving Forward that she created began trending locally as parents from other schools shared their own experiences with institutional indifference to bullying. The movement grew beyond Willowbrook Academy as families throughout the district demanded better protection for their children and greater accountability from educational institutions. Oliver Pemberton found himself at the center of a public scrutiny that his 11-year-old mind was unprepared to handle. The protective bubble of privilege and influence that had previously shielded him from consequences suddenly evaporated, leaving him exposed to judgment and criticism from the broader community. His carefully constructed social position within the school collapsed as former allies distanced themselves from the controversy. Margaret Pemberton's response revealed the desperation of someone watching decades of carefully built social capital crumble in real time. Her attempts to control the narrative through traditional influence networks failed as the evidence against Oliver was too compelling and too well documented to discredit. Her threats to withdraw financial support from the school backfired when other donors expressed concern about associating with an institution that tolerated bullying. Isabella Whitmore faced the most difficult decision of her professional career. The board of directors was demanding immediate action to restore the school's reputation, while the Pemberton family continued to pressure her to minimize the situation and protect Oliver from serious consequences. The media attention had made maintaining the status quo impossible, forcing her to choose between institutional integrity and political expediency. The turning point came when Lucas Hamilton himself requested permission to address the school community. Catherine was initially reluctant to expose her son to additional scrutiny, but Lucas insisted that sharing his experience might help other children who were suffering in silence. His courage in speaking publicly about his ordeal became a powerful catalyst for institutional change. Lucas's presentation to the school assembly was remarkable for its maturity and emotional impact. He described not just the specific incidents of harassment, but the broader atmosphere of fear that had affected his entire educational experience. His words resonated particularly strongly with other students, many of whom came forward afterward to share their own experiences with bullying that had previously gone unreported. The ripple effects extended far beyond Willowbrook Academy as other educational institutions began reviewing their own anti-bullying policies and procedures. The case became a textbook example of how institutional failures could be exposed and addressed through organized parent advocacy and strategic public pressure. Catherine's success in forcing accountability sparked a broader conversation about the role of privilege and influence in shaping institutional responses to student welfare issues. The case highlighted how traditional power structures could be challenged when parents were willing to document problems systematically and pursue public accountability rather than private resolution. The transformation of Catherine Hamilton from cooperative volunteer to fierce advocate inspired other parents throughout the district to become more actively involved in monitoring their children's educational experiences. The passive assumption that schools would automatically protect student welfare was replaced by a culture of engaged oversight and active advocacy that benefited all children in the community. 6 months after the gala incident that shook Willowbrook Academy to its core, the transformation of both the institution and the individuals involved had been profound and lasting. Catherine Hamilton stood in the same assembly hall where her son Lucas had bravely shared his story, but this time she was addressing a very different audience and a fundamentally changed school environment. The comprehensive reforms that Catherine and her allies had demanded were now fully implemented throughout the district. Every teacher and staff member had completed extensive training on recognizing and addressing bullying behavior, while new reporting procedures ensured that concerns could not be dismissed or minimized as they had been in the past. An independent oversight committee, including parent representatives, now monitored the school's response to student welfare issues. Oliver Pemberton had been transferred to a specialized therapeutic school program designed to address his behavioral issues through intensive counseling and structured intervention. The change of environment, combined with consistent professional support, had begun to help him understand the impact of his actions and develop healthier ways of interacting with peers. Margaret Pemberton, initially resistant to this placement, had come to recognize that her grandson needed help that traditional educational settings could not provide. The legal consequences for Willowbrook Academy had been significant, but ultimately constructive. The settlement with affected families included not only financial compensation, but also mandated reforms and ongoing monitoring to ensure compliance with improved student protection policies. Isabella Whitmore had resigned her position, replaced by an administrator with extensive experience in student welfare and crisis management. Lucas Hamilton's transformation was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire situation. The quiet, withdrawn child who had suffered in silence had developed into a confident young advocate for student rights. His experience with bullying, while traumatic, had taught him valuable lessons about resilience and the importance of speaking up for those who could not protect themselves. Catherine's advocacy work had evolved beyond the immediate concerns that first motivated her involvement. She had established a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting families dealing with bullying situations and helping educational institutions develop more effective prevention and intervention strategies. Her approach emphasized documentation, legal awareness, and strategic communication as tools for forcing institutional accountability. The broader community impact extended far beyond the immediate families involved in the original controversy. Other school districts had adopted similar reforms proactively, recognizing that the Willowbrook situation demonstrated the legal and reputational risks of inadequate student protection policies. Educational conferences throughout the region now featured presentations on the case as an example of effective parent advocacy and institutional reform. Margaret Pemberton faced the most difficult personal reckoning of anyone involved in the situation. The collapse of her social standing and the revelation of her grandson's behavioral problems had forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about privilege, accountability, and family responsibility. She had begun participating in family therapy sessions with Oliver and had quietly made significant donations to anti-bullying organizations as a form of restitution. The relationship between the Hamilton and Pemberton families remained complex and evolved slowly over time. While direct forgiveness was not immediately possible, both families had come to understand how institutional failures had contributed to the escalation of problems that might have been resolved through earlier intervention. Their shared experience of navigating crisis had created an unexpected foundation for eventual reconciliation. The long-term impact on student culture at Willowbrook Academy was perhaps the most important outcome of
Catherine's intervention.
A new generation of students grew up in an environment where bullying behavior was consistently addressed rather than tolerated, where reporting concerns was encouraged rather than discouraged, and where student welfare was prioritized over administrative convenience or donor relationships. Catherine's story became a powerful example of how individual determination and strategic action could transform institutional culture when traditional channels failed to protect vulnerable children. Her success demonstrated that parents did not need to accept inadequate responses to serious problems, but that effective advocacy required careful planning, thorough documentation, and willingness to pursue public accountability when private interventions proved insufficient. The ultimate lesson of the Willowbrook Academy transformation was that sustainable change required addressing both individual behavior and institutional systems. Oliver's therapeutic intervention addressed his personal issues, while the comprehensive policy reforms ensured that future problems would be recognized and addressed before they could escalate to crisis levels. Years later, as Lucas Hamilton graduated at the top of his class and prepared for college, Catherine reflected on the journey that had transformed her family and community. The courage to stand up for her son had created ripple effects that protected countless other children and demonstrated the power of organized parent advocacy in creating lasting educational reform.